Live from Washington, D.C., this is Balance of Power with Joe Mathieu and Kailey Leinz.
The uncertainty is spreading. Welcome to the Monday edition, with the president hiking tariffs in the wake of last week's Supreme Court ruling that struck them down. A partial government shutdown reaching day 10. And of course, possible military strikes against Iran still on the table. It's a new week with the same concerns. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kailey Leinz in Washington. Thank you for being with us here on the Monday edition. All of this hitting a day before the State of the Union, Kailey, and the markets don't seem to like any of it.
No, they certainly don't. Maybe a little bit of AI fear is prevalent in today's market action as well. But yes, to your point, Joe, it's quite a week for all of these stories to intersect as the president gets set to address a joint session of Congress, the justices of the Supreme Court, and the nation tomorrow. Will it be largely focused on his domestic economic agenda? Because that has to do with tariffs. Will it focus on his geopolitical ambitions? Because that probably leads us to Iran. Maybe we'll get a little bit of both. The president told those gathered at the White House today for an event that it's going to be a long speech because he's got a lot to talk about.
In conclusion, so I guess he's going to hit them all. The question is, will he stay on script is another one. And what will be the other side of the room? Will there be decorum, or is this going to be a shouting fest like we've seen the last couple of years? We'll find out together with special coverage tomorrow night here on Bloomberg.
Indeed. But first, we have our coverage today, and we're going to be focused on these issues specifically. We're going to check in a moment with Mike McKee, who's at the National Association of Business Economics Conference. Quite a day for that to be in town as well, considering the uncertainty regarding the president's tariffs. As President Trump is threatening he may send tariffs higher for countries that aren't playing ball on trade. But we know with the authority he's currently using, or the one he used over the weekend to enact 15% tariffs on our trading partners, Section 122, he can only raise it to that level, and it can only last for so long.
That's right. FAFO seems to be the message from the president. In the meantime, he's got 6 months to play with.
Indeed, he does. 150 days, but we know that can go by quick. So we'll be keeping track of that story today, but we have to check on the markets as well as the tariff narrative, the AI narrative. All of it is fueling today's action. So Charlie Pellet's taking a look from New York. Hey, Charlie.
Well, hello there, Kailey Leinz. Hello, Joe Mathieu. Indeed, a blizzard of selling right now. The snow coming down, and so are stocks. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ, all in the red right now. Very close to session lows. A 1% drop on the S&P to 68.38. Dow Industrials down 736 now, down 1.5%. NASDAQ down 1.1% with a 10-year currently yielding 4.02%. Gold up $101. That's an advance of 2%. 52.07 where we stand on gold. And a sell-off right now for Bitcoin, plunging 4.3%. 64,693 on Bitcoin. Again, recapping, S&P down 1%. Joe and Kailey, that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie Pellet checking the markets from New York. Thank you so much. As Charlie was alluding to, there's quite the intersection between what's happening on Wall Street, or how Wall Street is reading what's happening in Washington, as President Trump is trying to continue his tariff regime, just using different authorities that involve a lot of numbers after the Supreme Court, of course, dealt him a major blow on Friday, ruling the tariffs he had placed under the Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEPA, unconstitutional or illegal. So now we're on to Section 122. Potentially Section 232, Section 301. Those later two, though, Joe, of course, require investigation, whereas the Section 122 tariffs are set to go into effect.
As if the alphabet soup in Washington were not enough. I'm getting a popsicle headache. If you are, you're not alone. It is 122 for now, but he's got 150 days there if you want to add more numbers, which is why many are thinking that 301 is going to be the longer-term solution here. But that involves an investigation. It's going to take some time, Kailey. And the markets don't love waiting in conditions like these. So let's start our coverage. Before we talk to Michael McKee with Jeff Mason, Bloomberg White House correspondent. He's on the North Lawn right now, which reminds me to tell you that Mayor Mamdani of New York will be holding a news briefing about 15 minutes from now on the storm cleanup. We didn't get nearly as much as New York here in the nation's capital, which allows us to talk to Jeff outdoors today. It's great to see you, Jeff. I don't know if we should assume that this is going to be the case for the next 150 days, or how long this 301 investigation is going to take, but what's the White House preparing for?
Well, I think you're right to say that they're basically wanting to have something in place to make up for what they lost on Friday, which was the broader executive authority that President Trump has taken for himself on trade and on tariffs since the beginning of his administration that the Supreme Court struck down. So they haven't said specifically what the plan is, other than what he told everyone in the White House press corps at the press conference on Friday, which is that they basically have the plan B, and those are all of these other authorities that you were just referencing. I don't think he's going to walk away from that in less than 150 days. What I think they're going to do is try to have something in place that's more permanent by the time that deadline passes.
Well, I guess it becomes a question of can they do so? Jeff, we've seen Section 232 investigations open before and concluded, and tariffs gone into place as a result. How much can this process be escalated, fast-tracked, if they're trying to make sure that the revenue gap does not actually grow?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't really know the answer, but what I do know that there's political will to do it as fast as they possibly can. But of course, having lost this case at the Supreme Court on Friday, they have to do it legally. They have to follow the statutes and the laws and the regulations that require the investigations that you were just referencing. So, I'm the wrong guy to say how long each of those investigations are required to take. But for sure, this is a president who will be putting a lot of pressure on his trade team to do them as fast as legally possible so that he can maintain that revenue stream that you mentioned.
All right, Jeff Mason, never the wrong guy. We appreciate your reporting from the White House North Lawn, of course, a correspondent for us here at Bloomberg. Thank you so much. And as we consider the political calculations the president and the administration are making around tariffs, clearly their decisions will have economic consequences as well. And I'm imagining that's featuring pretty heavily in the discussion at the location where we find Bloomberg's Michael McKee. He is joining us live from here in Washington, but at the National Association of Business Economics Conference, NABE, which, Mike, I am sure the market driving forces we're looking at today, both this tariff conversation as well as artificial intelligence, are also a lot of what you're hearing about.
There's a lot of talk about both here, Kailey, but it's really the labor market that has caught most people's attention for the moment, because the folks here that they're paying attention to are central bankers. Governor Chris Waller of the Federal Reserve this morning saying that he's not sure the strong January payroll numbers are a trend, and he wants to see the February payroll numbers before deciding whether he would advocate for another cut at the March meeting. His view on the tariffs is they don't change much under this 15% Section 122 method that the president is using now, and there's no real certainty about what the president's going to be able to do with the various other sections he might imply. But to Waller, it doesn't matter, because even if they provide some more inflation, he still says it's going to be a one-off kind of thing. Prices go up once and then stop rising, so he's going to look through it. He's not particularly worried about it yet. We're also hearing right now from Christine Lagarde, who said that basically Europe is kind of behind the U.S. on AI, but has enormous potential out there. And Europe is trying its best to get its act together and to move forward and keep up with the U.S. So AI and trade and tariffs and the labor market, the big concerns here right now.
Well, that seems to be plenty to go around here, Michael McKee. And if the real worry is not about tariffs, at least when it comes to Mr. Waller, I'm wondering, how we rationalize this reaction in the marketplace. And news today, for instance, from the European Union, that they're going to put the trade deal that they struck with the United States on ice until they learn more. Doesn't that further cloud the picture?
Oh, absolutely. It clouds the picture. It makes it more uncertain. And Waller and Christine Lagarde both acknowledge that. But the problem is there's no sense on when there will be clarity, because we don't know how long these investigations will take. We don't know what the administration is going to come up with at the end of that. So it just leaves everybody sort of up in the air and just continuing on the way they have been now. And it probably means we don't see huge price increases right yet, but we could down the road. So that's something to keep track of. And then, of course, is the question of what will AI do to the labor market down the road? There have been some sessions on that as well. And again, nobody knows. This is a very uncertain time for economists as well as politicians.
Uncharted is a word we like to use when we talk to Michael McKee. It's great to have you back, sir. We thank you, and good to have you in town at the NABE conference, Bloomberg International Economics and Policy Correspondent. As we add the voice now of Lori Wallach, the director of the Rethink Trade Program at American Economic Liberties Project, with our eyes on tariffs and what might come next. Lori, it's good to have you with us here on Bloomberg TV and radio. 122, 301. Do you even care when we're talking about tariffs at 10 or 15%?
The president is looking to reestablish that same rate of tariffs that he had under IEEPA. And there is a smorgasbord of different congressional delegations of tariff authority that I suspect they're going to sequence into place to try and achieve that outcome.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so when we consider what outcome President Trump would like to get, specifically what he would like to elicit from our trading partners in the form of deals, the president took to Truth Social earlier this morning to say any country that wants to, quote, play games with the ridiculous Supreme Court decision, especially those that have ripped off the USA for years and even decades, will be met with a much higher tariff, and worse than which they just recently agreed to. I think he probably is alluding to the EU here, Lori. But when we consider how high those tariffs can go, is there a limit under these other authorities? Because, of course, with IEEPA, he just kind of slapped whatever rate he felt appropriate. Can he do so using other legal grounds?
There are other legal grounds that actually allow quite high tariffs. So the unexplored IEEPA-like instrument is a law called Section 338 of the Trade Act of 1930. It hasn't been used since World War II. No one knows how it would go if it were challenged in court, which certainly it would be, but that would take many months. That allows up to 50% for an unlimited amount of time on a presidential, basically self-finding of a fact of discrimination against the interests of the United States. So that one's very loose. The other provision, Section 232, which is you have to have a report finding a national security basis for raising tariffs, in Section 301, which requires an investigation. You need to find basically unfair practices against the United States of a particular country. Those mechanisms have more procedures on the front end, but they don't have limits on the back end with respect to how high the tariffs can go. And all of those have an unlimited time. So Section 122 is maximum 15% for a balance of payments problem for only 5 months. The other ones, the three of them, 301 and 232, have gone through the courts and have been declared fine. 338, more of a mystery, but lots of other delegated authorities for a president to use tariffs.
And for those other three approaches, how long would these investigations last? Might they outlast the midterms?
Section 338, again, not used since before I was born, is a process that can be very speedy. I guess the outlying question as far as how long it could stay in place is if it got challenged in court, how long it would take before you'd have a ruling that would take it down if it were ruled against. As far as Sections 232 and Sections 301, it's probably unhelpful to say, but it kind of depends. It depends how many countries, how many issues, and also the quality of the investigation. There have not been cases challenging the qualities of the investigations. A very good Section 301 investigation can be done in 4 or 5 months. Typically, they take longer. It just depends how many people they're going to put on it. I think that, as far as the midterms, the big X factor is, as far as Section 122, the 150 days runs out on July 24th, and then it goes to Congress to try and extend it. And that could really make an interesting political problem because members of Congress would have to go on the record right then about whether they want to extend that authority or not.
Well, and we've already heard from the Senate Minority Leader, Chuck Schumer, who has suggested Democrats will not vote for an extension. That probably makes it a dead-on-arrival proposition in the Senate when we consider the 60-vote threshold. On Section 122, you mentioned how that will run out in July. Is there time between now and July for that to be challenged in a court of law? When we consider the authority he's using or the justification for using that authority, are we in a balance of payments crisis right now? Could that not end up in court?
So I recommend folks should look at the actual proclamation they issued. They actually have thought it through and they make a case that is not wrong. It is a case that maybe could get challenged. Almost certainly, to answer the direct question, almost certainly a lawsuit's going to get filed. But in the 5 months, it seems extremely unlikely that will work its way through the courts to a point where there would be a final order. So yes, a challenge, but no, not probably a decision. As far as the merits of the case, it's not the people who are saying this is ridiculous. They're basically looking back at the time period when that statute was written, and we were just coming off of a gold-based currency. And those conditions obviously were not literally in a balance of payments crisis in the sense of checks are going to bounce. But in the sense of what a balance of payments crisis is with respect to our overall current account balance and other factors, you can make the case, which they do in this proclamation, and economists watching, everyone look and come back to us trade lawyers and say what you think. But yeah, I think that it will get challenged. I also think, though, that they've got other potential laws to put in place that they could do in that period of time. The much bigger X factor, honestly, is the refunds.
Well, I'm glad you just brought that up, because as we wait to hear from the mayor of New York, he's going to be holding a news conference any moment now on the storm cleanup. Lori, there are huge questions about refunds. No one's got any answers, and we know a lot of lawsuits have already been filed and were filed in advance of the Supreme Court ruling. We heard earlier today from the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee in the House, was speaking with us here on Bloomberg TV and radio with his thoughts on the prospect of paying back all this money. Listen.
In regards to the tariffs, I think it's very certain there's probably not going to be any refunds. I don't see a pathway in Congress that there's going to be refunds. And so you're going to look at over the course of President Trump's administration, he's going to continue to use those tariff revenues to bring down the deficit.
What do you think about Congressman Jason Smith there, Lori? And if you're a Costco, for instance, and you already filed suit, does that put you at the front of the line potentially?
So I suspect there are a lot of people in boardrooms who have a very different take than Chairman Smith about that question. And honestly, as a trade lawyer, I would say the question is not an if, it's actually a how question. There's a history of tariffs being refunded and there are different mechanisms. The thing that's particularly thorny with this situation as compared to the usual situation, which is, say, a preference program, like the generalized system of preferences, doesn't get renewed. And so you have to pay in for an extra year when it should have been renewed and you wouldn't have had to pay, then that money comes back. In this instance, the tariffs were so broad on so many goods affecting so many countries that actually there's a big question where there's a gap between who is booked at customs for the entity that paid a tariff and who actually paid. So as a practical matter, it's going to be extremely difficult to figure out a fair way to do it. So Costco is so big that in some circumstances, I bet their procurement people would fess up to the fact they probably made their foreign suppliers cover a lot of the tariff by either giving them a lower price on the good or by literally paying a payment to have to cover that expense as a condition for continuing to source from that particular tariffed entity overseas. So the big companies that have dominant market positions and basically monopoly power could avoid paying. Some of them then, not saying Costco did, passed on expenses to consumers. So even though they didn't pay, they raised their prices. And then you've got companies that raised prices that didn't get charged tariffs at all. So you've got a big question of how the consumer is made whole.
Yeah.
How you don't end up with windfall profits from companies that didn't pay but are booked as paying. And then there's always the question for small businesses. What is a system that hopefully is even less complicated than like paycheck protection so they don't have to go to court?
Well, Lori, when we consider these questions around refunds, I would point to what a former senator from Ohio, hoping to be a senator from Ohio, again, Sherrod Brown, the Democrat, is out on X posting about today. He says he's calling for a $1,336 refund for every Ohio household, saying that the reckless tariffs ruled illegal by the Supreme Court cost Ohioans $6.5 billion. That's not really how this will work, though, right? You aren't going to see direct checks to households like that.
You know, given the complexity I was just describing, that's as fair a way of doing it, honestly.
Really?
Than anything that's going to come out. One way or another, there's going to be an unfairness. And given how many people have been hit, by rising prices, some of it, again, price gouging using the cover of tariffs. I mean, the beef situation is a classic. 80% of the beef we eat in the U.S. is grown and processed here. So only 20% of imports, and of that, half of it has always been duty-free because it comes from Mexico and Canada, which from day one under the Trump tariffs have had a duty-free exception. So we've seen the prices of beef go through the ceiling, has nothing to do with tariffs, yet it's been claimed by the grocery stores, the meat packers, oh, we can't help you, it's tariffs, we have to pass through the price. So if you had, for instance, the Costcos and those guys who have the wherewithal to sue, getting back the money, but actually a lot of consumers have been the ones who in the end paid, and some of the big retailers didn't pay at all because they had the leverage to make someone else carry it for them. How is that fairer than Senator Brown's idea of giving everyone a check?
Wow. Lori, it's fascinating and refreshing to speak with someone who knows as much about this as you do, because there are a lot of armchair experts in Washington right now when it comes to tariffs. The president said on Friday when he met the press after the ruling, going forward, we will be able to take in more money and there will no longer be doubt. Is the first part of that true? He will be able to take in more money from fill in the blank, whether it's consumer, importer, or foreign country, with the new tariff regime than the old one?
I think it is hypothetically possible, although seems somewhat improbable. So as a legal matter, if they used all of the authorities that they have, at least like in the year period, the short term, they might be able to bring in the $150 billion. That is more or less what I think the most clean estimates are of the revenue they brought in to date since Liberation Day. And I think, you know, with the laws that they have, they could do that. They could approximate the same kind of tariff levels that they were able to do under IEEPA. Whether or not that's what they're going to do is a different question.
All right, Lori, great stuff. We appreciate your expertise. Lori Wallach, director of the Rethink Trade program at the American Economic Liberties Project. Thank you so much. We want to go live now to New York City, where the mayor, Zohar Mamdani, is briefing, holding a press conference on the storm, knowing that the travel ban in New York has been lifted effective as of noon. Let's listen into him live on Bloomberg TV and radio.
To keep our roadways clear so that emergency vehicles can get through. Every vehicle that stays off the road makes that work that little bit easier. These are dangerous conditions. Not only is snow continuing to fall, accumulated snowfall and refreezing have made it hazardous to travel. If you can, remain indoors. If you must leave your home, please rely on public transit. I am grateful for our tireless agency teams who have been working nonstop to prepare our city for this blizzard and to keep New York running. This has been a full-force winter weather response operation, with 2,600 sanitation workers deployed on every 12-hour shift and over 2,300 plows, including 700 salt spreaders mobilized citywide. In addition, DSNY has employed 575 emergency snow shovelers across our city last night, with more than 800 shovelers on the morning shift today. Despite the active blizzard, they were able to clear over 1,600 crosswalks, 419 fire hydrants, and almost 900 bus stops overnight. And that does not include what they have cleared since this morning. Amidst this, DSNY has been hard at work to expand their supervision capacity for the snow shoveler program. And as of today, they can now deploy 1,800 New Yorkers per shift. Due to the historic nature of this blizzard, we've increased pay to $30 per hour. You can walk into any DSNY garage until 8 p.m. this evening and then starting again at 9 a.m. tomorrow. All you need to bring is 2 forms of ID to ensure you get paid. In addition to DSNY, the DOT has also cleared over 1,300 sheltered bus stops so far. All of this is managed through DSNY's Blade Runner 2.0 system, which monitors plowing and salting in real time. You too can track their live progress via our plow tracker at nyc.gov/plownyc. As of 12:30 p.m., DSNY has distributed over 50 million pounds of salt and plowed over 99.5% of city streets at least once. As heavy snow continues to fall, every single street in every single borough will be plowed as many times as necessary to make it safe for emergency travel. As I mentioned earlier, parts of Staten Island are being hit hardest by this winter storm. In addition to existing efforts, DSNY is deploying 65 further pieces of equipment to Staten Island, and the NYPD Tow Truck Task Force is now operating especially heavily in the borough to free stuck vehicles, which include MTA buses. Our teams will continue to salt again and again throughout the day. This work has been a testament to the whole of government coming together to tackle a shared challenge. The NYPD Highway Patrol will continue escorting DSNY to facilitate the salting and plowing of our streets. And the Down Trees Task Force has been coordinating across the 5 boroughs. Again, I'm imploring New Yorkers to stay off the roads. The fewer passenger and commercial vehicles need to be assisted, the quicker we can respond to plows and emergency vehicles. And if you can cook at home, please do so instead of ordering food to be delivered, given the conditions. I hope our students enjoy their snow day today and stay warm and safe throughout, but I do have some tough news to share. School will be in person tomorrow. You can still pelt me with snowballs when you see me. Alternate side parking will be suspended through the week. NYC Ferry remains suspended for the rest of today, while the Staten Island Ferry is running half-hour service through the day. A decision will be made on tomorrow's service for both the Staten Island and NYC ferries later today. All public libraries across the city remain closed today. An update on reopening tomorrow will be made and shared later this afternoon. City buildings will be back open to the public tomorrow for in-person city services. Code Blue remains in effect, and an enhanced Code Blue has been extended through Wednesday morning. Throughout this storm, our outreach workers have continually canvassed all 5 boroughs, helping homeless New Yorkers find shelter. Last night, outreach workers made 79 placements. I want to be very clear. If you need warmth and shelter, it is available to you. This morning, our Department of Social Services accelerated the opening of another 100 low-barrier stabilization beds in Upper Manhattan, building on the additional capacity we added during the historic cold snap a few weeks ago. Across our city, we have had 22 warming buses, 11 health and hospitals warming spaces, and 13 school warming centers open. Our health and hospitals mobile warming units have been redeployed to provide clinical assistance, warm food, and clothing. By this afternoon, we will have 15 mobile warming units citywide. Our on-point overdose prevention centers were also open all of last night and will remain open today and overnight tonight as well. I continue to ask New Yorkers to check in on those who may be struggling. If you see someone in need of warmth or shelter, please call 311 immediately so outreach workers can assist. In a Code Blue, these 311 calls will be rerouted to 911. You can also call 311 directly from our Link NYC kiosks or use them to find the locations of warming centers across the city. We are aware that there were power outages across the city, including over 11,000 New Yorkers in the Rockaways who were without power this morning. NYSEM dispatched field personnel to check conditions and make repairs. Power has already been restored to more than 8,000 of those New Yorkers. As a contingency, NYSEM has opened warming centers at Far Rockaway High School, Beach Channel High School, and PS 43. For New Yorkers dealing with heat or hot water issues, call your landlord immediately. If you do not hear back promptly, please call 311. HPD staff is working overtime and is on call to help. NYCHA has deployed additional staff this weekend, including technical teams to respond to elevator, heat, and any other repair issues that may arise. If you are a NYCHA resident dealing with a non-emergency issue, please call 718-707-7771 or submit a work ticket through the My NYCHA application. Lyft began clearing operations at City Bike stations this morning and have cleared 20 stations as of 11:30 a.m. With additional vendors starting at different points throughout the day, we expect their progress to rapidly accelerate as the afternoon continues. And operational agencies have been working to clear fire hydrants, crosswalks, and bus stops around their property as well. While DSNY continues to prioritize snow response, there will be delays in collection. There will be no collection of any material today, February 23rd, or tomorrow, February 24th. We will provide an updated plan on trash collection by end of day tomorrow on what collection will look like for the rest of the week. When we share that plan, we will be prioritizing trash and compost. Recycling will continue to be delayed into the following week. Please hold your recycling and wait to put it out until next week, as you would after certain holidays. Our mandate for property owners to clear 4-foot wide paths across all sidewalks remains in effect. We issued more than 4,000 violations after the last storm. We do not want to issue as many citations again. So please, if you are a property owner, do your part, clear the snow, and help make our city passable for our neighbors, especially those with disabilities. For those shoveling, take it slow. This snow is exceptionally wet and heavy. Your health comes first. Please protect your back and your heart by working slowly and make sure that you're taking frequent breaks. Older adults should stay indoors and should avoid shoveling. The coastal flood warning for low-lying coastal parts of our city ended at 5 a.m. this morning. There are no current warnings issued for our coast flood zones. For those in flood zones,
New York Mayor Mamdani speaking live here on Bloomberg TV and radio. We wanted to get a sense of what the mayor had for us here with regard to tomorrow. I'm sorry, kids. In-person school is the news. Now that the travel ban has ended, we're keeping tabs, of course, on the next round of snow that's going to be potentially coming later in the week. We'll let you know if he goes to questions and makes any more news. The mayor holding a news briefing at the lunch hour here in New York. I'm Joe Mathieu in Washington. Thanks for being with us on the Monday edition of Balance of Power. It was on Friday I had a chance to spend some time with the Republican running for governor of New York, Bruce Blakeman. He's the county executive, Nassau County, and has some pretty strong feelings about what's happening in the city, even though he's, of course, aiming to be elected and take office in Albany. The so-called bailout that he has called it from Kathy Hochul to help address a major budget shortfall in the city of New York, something that he is not a fan of. It's where we started our conversation here on Bloomberg. Listen.
You don't give candy to a diabetic. And basically, the state of Florida has less of a budget than the city of New York. There's something fundamentally wrong with that. We have policies here that don't work in favor of the taxpayers, don't work in favor of the ratepayers. We have a subway system that is unsafe, that is dirty. People don't pay their fares. We need to start making sure that we have a transportation system that people want to use, that's safe and secure and clean, and make them pay for it. 60% of people who use the subway don't even pay the fares. They just go past the turnstiles. So that's one of the areas that we could make it more efficient. We could provide better services, and we could do it in a way that didn't kill the taxpayers of the city of New York and the state of New York.
Mm-hmm. You know, Mayor Mamdani has said repeatedly that Albany has underfunded New York City in relation to its tax contribution. Do you think New York City gets its fair share?
Yeah, I think New York City gets its fair share. I think New York City needs to start managing their fiscal affairs better. I have a county that's larger than 8 states. I've gotten 7 bond upgrades in the last 3 years, which is unprecedented, and I haven't raised taxes a single penny. As a matter of fact, I canceled a $150 million tax hike by my predecessor. So if you manage government more like a business, if you provide quality services at a cost-efficient price, then you'll get a balanced budget. They can't do that in New York City because nobody's managing it. I mean, Zohran Mamdani has no executive or business experience. The guy's never run the graveyard shift of a Dairy Queen in the middle of the winter, and now he's running one of the biggest economies in the world. He's in over his head, and the state of New York should not bail him out for his own mismanagement.
Would you try to make a partnership with the mayor? Obviously, you'd have to work with the mayor of New York City, or would this be a difficult relationship?
Well, that's up to him. If he enforces the law and makes for safe communities, then I will support that. I will help with that. But if he doesn't enforce the law and he makes it unsafe to live in New York City, as governor, I will stop that. If he ruins the economy of New York City, I will stop him. I want to create economic development and job prosperity. New York City is very important to the economy of the state of New York, and I'm not going to let the mayor of the city of New York ruin the economy in New York City, which would have a ripple effect on the rest of the state.
Would you propose legislation to remove New York City as a sanctuary city?
Well, from day one as governor, I would not create a sanctuary state. I would eliminate us being a sanctuary state, just as I did in Nassau County on day one.
How do you get that done?
By executive order. I would issue an executive order my first day in office saying that New York State is no longer a sanctuary state. Kathy Hochul has spent billions and billions of dollars of taxpayer dollars on people who have been here for 15 minutes. They came illegally. They haven't earned it. What about all the immigrants that came here legally? What about the people who came here before us, immigrants that worked hard for all that they have achieved? Now we're going to give billions of dollars when we could use the money for schools, we could use the money for hospitals, we could use the money to cut taxes, we could use the money for infrastructure. She's just given billions and billions of dollars away for people who just arrived here. That is a disgrace. I will end that on day one.
Would you welcome ICE agents to the state of New York to remove those immigrants you referred to?
Yeah, my policy in Nassau County has been to work with ICE. I have a comprehensive agreement with them. We removed, in just 1 year, 2,000 illegal migrants with criminal records, ranging from attempted murder to rape to kidnapping to carjacking to robbery. And it has made us the safest county in America, according to U.S. News and World Report, and I believe that. We've got a great police department. We fund them. And working with ICE, we've made it safer. However, I told my police department and ICE that I did not want raids on schools, on daycare centers, on houses of worship, waiting in front of hospitals, that their focus should be on illegal migrants with criminal records or who have committed crimes, either in Nassau County or anywhere in the metropolitan area. And again, we removed 2,000 criminals from the streets of the metropolitan area. Where would Kathy Hochul like to put them? She wants to put them back in the streets to prey on the communities of New York? I don't think so. I think that basically our policy is sound. It's got common sense, and it's the right way to approach things. But we do have to have a comprehensive immigration policy where people who have been here for a long period of time, who may have a child in school, if they're law-abiding and they're gainfully employed, I don't think it's compassionate to remove them from communities. I think we have to have a path to legality for them. So I think we have to have a comprehensive immigration policy. We need to be compassionate. We need to use common sense. And I think basically they contribute to the economy in a lot of different businesses, such as the hospitality industry, landscapers, golf courses, many other industries, farming, that they are an important part of our economy. We need those workers, and we should have a path to legality for them.
That's Republican Executive Nassau County Bruce Blakeman, who's running for governor of New York. In our conversation from Friday, we wanted to make sure you had a chance to hear some of his insights on an issue that has brought us to another partial government shutdown. Kailey, it's day 10, DHS closure. We have no end in sight here, although an interesting back and forth between Democrats and the White House. Tom Homan again reinforcing some of the changes that have been made when it comes to ICE agents in the field.
And of course, Republicans contend those changes should be enough to satisfy Democrats and to fund the Department of Homeland Security once again. So the question is, are we going to see forward progress this week as lawmakers return to Washington? They were supposed to be back today. Turns out they're not going to get back till tomorrow because of the snowstorm.
Yes.
And tomorrow, of course, is also State of the Union. So we might have to wait at least 2 more days to see any kind of forward progress, though likely it will be longer. And on that note, we turn to our political panel. Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino are with us. Rick, of course, Republican strategist and Stonecourt Capital partner. Jeanne, a democracy visiting fellow at Harvard Kennedy School's Ash Center and Democratic analyst for us. Thank you both. So, Jeanne, obviously we know Democrats have been have had a laundry list of proposals that they would like to see. We understand they have viewed the White House counteroffers as insufficient. It seems like we're going nowhere quite fast. Once everyone's back in Washington, do you see this process accelerating, or is there just not adequate political pressure to come to a resolution?
Yeah, I think you said it perfectly at the end, Kailey. There's not pressure yet. I think the pressure may come. You and Joe were talking about the White House releasing this Tom Homan plan. That clearly is sort of dead in the water for Democrats. That 1 or 2 pager they put out doesn't go far enough for Democrats. And quite frankly, neither side has really the political incentive to move at this point. I think we saw DHS try over the weekend to move in that direction, suspending some of the programs, then pulling back on that. I think is just quickly a reminder that both sides are pretty dug in. And I'll tell you one thing that has made Democrats dig in even more is this revelation about this shooting that occurred in Texas, where an ICE officer fatally shot a man in March at San Padre Island. I think those kinds of revelations are making some kind of middle ground even harder to get to at this point.
Rick, I'm looking at this one sheet that came from the White House to Democrats' offices on the Hill, and it's got bullets on some of the changes that have been made, including limiting teams to conduct targeted immigration enforcement as opposed to roving. Body-worn cameras deployed. We knew that as well. And interesting here, it reaffirmed policies to federal officers. They must clearly display their badge and other adequate law enforcement identifiers. There's no demasking on here, and I don't see anything more about the use of warrants when it comes to raids. Is this as good as it's going to get from the administration?
It'll just depend upon how much pain they're willing to take. These are negotiations. The fact that some of it's sort of popping out publicly is probably not productive to the outcome because obviously there are a lot of different Democrats with different views on what they want. And it's ideal that the negotiators are able to control that public messaging. And I do think Republicans are going to start getting the message that they've got to get something done on this. I mean, we saw Ipsos poll earlier in the program that talked about immigration and how independents by a margin of 63% didn't like what they were seeing out of ICE. So when you see those numbers on independents and you've got a midterm coming up, you got to patch that hole. It's not good enough just to rally the base. And so I do think there is some heat on Republicans to find a way to get this done. One of the reasons why the White House is directly engaged, one of the reasons Homan is the one doing it, because he's trying to instill some confidence in the Democrats to actually get to a deal. So is it going to take a while? It may. And it just depends upon when this administration is willing to sign on to something. But I think there's still a lot more wood to chop when it comes to what is it going to be a final deal.
Well, so does the president use the State of the Union address tomorrow night, Rick, to try to inch closer to a deal, or is it just an opportunity to call out Democrats for not playing ball and for keeping this agency or this department shuttered?
I think most of the Republicans I talked to over the weekend are worried that the State of the Union is going to be an attack on Democrats and their weakness on immigration, which actually will do no help to getting a deal done. He can't help himself. The Democrat likes President Trump likes to demagogue this issue. He always has, probably always will. I sincerely doubt there's going to be any kind of a effort to find common ground in the president's speech on tomorrow night. And so it may actually be a backfire and make the negotiations even more difficult.
Well, what's going to be Democrats' approach, Jeannie, to this State of the Union? I'll probably ask you this again tomorrow after we see more social media. I mean, is it going to be yelling and signs, or are we going to have an attempt to return to decorum?
I think there's going to be yelling and signs outside of the room as some of them rally, some of them stay away. We know Hakeem Jeffries has said in the room or advised in the room they should be quiet and follow decorum. But what they're going to be talking about, of course, is exactly what Rick just alluded to. Are these polls, the Ipsos poll you were talking about earlier, 6 out of 10, 7 out of 10 Americans opposing ICE tactics, opposing Donald Trump's approach to immigration, 70% saying you need judicial warrants. He's 18% under the water on immigration, something that got him elected or helped get him elected 2 times to the White House. These are bad numbers. That's what Democrats want to talk about. And to Rick's point, I don't think the president's going to shy away from saying, I own this issue, which clearly the polls show he does not anymore.
Great conversation with our panel, and it's great to have you both back together. Bloomberg Politics contributors Jeanne, Zaino, and Rick Davis, they will play a big role in our coverage tomorrow night, and we'll meet you on the late edition of Balance of Power coming up at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kailey Leinz in Washington. We've got our eyes on stocks here. The whole conversation about a partial government shutdown continuing with no end in sight. Tariffs, of course, with great uncertainty following the ruling on Friday and the president's approach here, not to mention this massive armada that has been assembled in the Middle East with eyes on Iran. It's not playing well when it comes to the financial markets today, kind of a collision course here when you add uncertainty over AI. Let's bring in Charlie Pellet. He's back today as well and brings us up to date on Wall Street. Charlie, what do you have?
Right now, looking at a move lower for the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ, perhaps the key takeaway at this hour, Joe Mathieu, we are off session lows. Still looking at a 660-point point drop on the Dow, down by 1.3%. S&P down 60 right now. That is a drop of 0.9%. The S&P at 68.49. NASDAQ down 213 for NASDAQ, a decline of 0.9%. Your 10-year at 4.02%. You correctly outlined all of the factors helping combine to send stocks lower. We've got the 2-year 3.44%. Gold is surging 2% now, 52.8 a barrel. The ounce on spot gold. Silver up 3.5%, 87.57 the ounce. West Texas Intermediate crude, though, retreating down 0.6%, 66.10 now for a barrel of West Texas Intermediate crude. Bitcoin down 3.9%. Bitcoin 64,940 on Bitcoin. New York Mayor Mamdani wrapping up a storm update. You heard it live on Bloomberg Television and radio. Key takeaway: in-person school resumes tomorrow in New York City. The mayor, however, continues to advise New Yorkers to stay indoors. It is a massive storm. It will rank as one of the top 10 snowiest on record. More than 15 inches of snow in New York City. The snow is expected to continue through the afternoon before tapering off. Other news: Novo Nordisk's next-generation obesity shot delivered less weight loss than Eli Lilly's rival Blockbuster, in yet another blow to the Danish company's attempts to regain lost ground in the weight loss market. Novo Nordisk, the ADR, is right now trading lower by 15.9%. Eli Lilly shares are gaining 4.4%. Again, recapping: school in New York resumes tomorrow. Stocks lower. Blizzard of selling with the S&P down 0.9. Joe and Kailey, that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie Pellet, he knows what he's talking about when it comes to this storm here. Charlie just got back from Alaska last night. This is nothing for him. Charlie, thank you. He'll have more on the markets coming up at the top of the hour, 2 p.m. Eastern time. With our eyes on Bitcoin and oil, as Charlie just mentioned, both heading lower today. In fact, we're looking at a 64 handle again on Bitcoin. I wanted to bring in Mike McGlone just to take a beat on this, because there's been nothing fun about this session, even if we are off our lows of the session. Bloomberg Intelligence senior commodity strategist Mike McGlone, welcome back. When you start seeing Bitcoin back below 65,000, I know that we're in a world here where the chart is broken. How do you interpret the selling?
Well, I think that's the absolute right word, Joe. It's broken. If you look at Bitcoin, the last 170 weeks, it's unchanged. That means the average buyer for over 3 years is not making any money. But if you look at the S&P 500 over the same time period, it's up about 30% from its 170-week moving average. Just showing the comparison, yet Bitcoin trades almost 2 times the volatility. So that's a broken asset class. Despite all the sell side telling how great it was to buy the ETFs, to me that marked the peak. It's a bear market. As a strategist, I say act accordingly, look to sell rallies. So I assume anything near 74,000 is legitimate resistance. I think it's just a matter of time now that breaks below 64 and heads to 50. But that's another thing it has in common with crude oil. Crude oil is a bear market, yet it's bumped up the upper end of the range. It's a question of when and where and how we start trying to test that bear market to go lower.
Well, I'm glad you brought up oil, Mike, because we in Washington are all waiting to see if President Trump is going to order a strike, whether a limited one in the middle of talks around a nuclear deal, or perhaps a more elongated conflict being started with Iran. How should we expect oil to react when we get the news, if we get it, considering how much price action we have seen amid questions around whether or not he's actually going to act?
Kate, I think the base case is, unless there's some kind of severe supply disruption that's enduring, crude oil can easily drop $5, head towards 60, and continue its bear market trend. So it needs some kind of shocker to pop it above 70 or 75, and that's exactly what the Western producers are waiting for, so they can sell forward, backwardate the curve a little more, bring on supply, rinse and repeat, the trend goes lower. So you see the trend there. Supply has shifted to the Western Hemisphere being the price maker. So I look at crude oil as, yes, right now it's under these dicey situations, but the kind of thing to look at, the key thing to remember is, what does Mr. Trump want for the midterms for the end of the year? Lower energy prices and some kind of resolution out of Iran would help that.
All right, Mike McGlone, Bloomberg commodity strategist in Miami for us. Thank you so much. Meantime, here in Washington, we're joined now for more conversation on Iran, specifically by Jeanne Gavito. She is senior advisor with the Cohen Group and former acting principal deputy assistant secretary of state for Near Eastern affairs under President Biden. Jeanne, thanks for being here on Bloomberg TV and radio. When we consider the reports we have gotten, and President Trump has actually confirmed this himself, that he is at least considering a limited strike on Iran in order effectively to pressure them into agree to something on the nuclear deal. Do you think that would be an effective strategy, or does it risk backfiring?
I'm deeply skeptical and think it indeed risks backfiring. One thing that I have not yet seen is a real explanation of what the objectives would be, either of the short-term strike or, frankly, the longer term. If the assumption is that the short term would push the Iranians back to the negotiating table and be willing to make concessions that they're not currently able to make, I think that that's probably not accurate. And so I think you really do risk Iran needing to retaliate in its mind immediately and setting off a cycle of escalation.
Well, when it comes to justification, it was interesting to hear from Scott Bessent over the weekend. The president has talked about the need for a nuclear deal. We've heard a lot of reporting around other elements, whether it's ballistic missiles or, in fact, regime change. But remember, he said 10 or 15 days was the timeline at the end of last week that he might be making a decision. Scott Bessent said on Fox over the weekend that the regime is probably a week away from having industrial-grade bomb-making material. That's a direct quote. Does that give us a better sense of what this administration's projecting?
I don't know that it does. I'm honestly a bit baffled.
Is that true?
By that assertion. President Trump said back in the summer after the initial strikes that the nuclear program had been obliterated. And so there is a wide swath between obliterated and being within a week away. There have been, and I certainly have not seen recent intelligence reports on this, but there have been various estimates over the years that have suggested that they are inching closer and closer to what we would call a breakout capacity. There is still a wide gap between the ability to enrich uranium at a weapons grade to a weapons grade point and the ability to actually deploy that in a bomb. And so when we say a week away, it certainly sounds startling. That doesn't mean that they're able to launch a nuclear strike within, say, a week or a month or even, say, 6 months. But again, I do think that probably the public and certainly the Congress deserve some answers about where this gap is between the obliteration that was described over the summer and this being used now as a justification for renewed conflict in the Middle East.
Well, and again, we get back to the notion of where that conflict will ultimately end us. Will we be talking about regime change in Iran? We actually were joined last week on Balance of Power by the former defense secretary in the first Trump administration, Mark Esper, who warned actually that if you want to see regime change in Iran, you may end up with potentially a worse result than you anticipate. This is what he told us.
And I think the experts would say that the odds are that the successor to the Khamenei regime is going to be a hardliner as equal to or greater than Khamenei. So it could be more likely than not somebody from the Islamic Republic Revolutionary Guard Corps. So those are the concerns, and that's why, I think if you were to step back and strategically think about this, what you want to do is prepare a much broader game plan.
So when we consider that notion, Rebecca, or Jeanne, and I saw you kind of nodding in agreement there, is regime change, pursuing it right now, advisable in your mind?
Every U.S. government and military gaming of this problem that has been done in recent years, to my knowledge, has led exactly to that result, that the IRGC would be the natural successor to a regime that has been changed. And that is almost certainly a worse outcome for the people of Iran than what we currently have. And so, again, I think until this administration can better identify, and perhaps they have behind closed doors, but better identify what the objectives are and what the day after planning for this looks like, I think going in with an attempt to remove the top level of the Iranian leadership without understanding what comes next and what that sets off as far as destabilization in a region that is really central to President Trump's economic objectives is ill-advised.
Do you buy this idea of a bloody nose strike unlocking some sort of a deal? And if not, I think you expressed some skepticism over this at the beginning of our conversation. What is the prolonged campaign that would follow? Because the next hammer to drop would be a lot bigger.
Absolutely. First of all, I think it is a miscalculation to assume that an initial strike would lead the Iranian regime to be in a position to make additional concessions. They are at a point of weakness, which again raises questions about why now. But they're really at a point of weakness. And so additional concessions beyond the degradation of their proxy groups that we've already seen, the degradation of the nuclear program that we've already seen, I think would be viewed as existential. And so I do think it's a miscalculation to assume that they have additional concessions to be able to make. So yes, then you get the question of what does a longer term campaign, either by design or in response to Iranian retaliation, then look like, and that gets very dicey. This is a massive country. This is not another Syria. This is a massive country with very deep bureaucratic structures, and so the idea of regime change there is just on a different level than what we've seen elsewhere in the region. And I, again, have not personally heard any explanation of how you would reconstruct a government. Does that involve long-term U.S. investment, for example? And I think that the assumption that the Iranian people would somehow rise up and kind of do the job for us is also probably wishful thinking.
So in our final moment here, Jen, as we consider the notion of Iranian retaliation, when we saw Iran retaliate back in June for the strikes on nuclear facilities, arguably it was a de-escalatory measure, right? Do you think they would make the same decision this time around?
I don't. Again, I go back to we are in what I would consider to be an existential moment for this regime. I think they've been very clear in their messaging that it would not be de-escalatory as it was in the summer. And so I think we would see attacks against our facilities in the region, against our allies and partners.
So the other Gulf states?
I think that would be a good assumption, yes.
We heard reporting from Axios, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, advising the president and top officials that a campaign against Iran could carry significant risks and bring a prolonged conflict. As Kailey said, we only have about a minute left here, or 30 seconds at this point. Does Donald Trump set himself up to learn a lesson of the limitations of airstrikes?
I certainly think so. If there were an easy kinetic answer to this problem, we would have taken it at some point over the last 20 years. Yes, I think this would be destabilizing, and I think that there are no easy answers here. So I think the U.S. would be in a position of not having an identified off-ramp to fall back on.
It's great to have you back with us, Jen. Jen Gavito with us from the Cohen Group. I'm Joe Mathieu in Washington alongside Kailey Leinz. We'll meet you on the late edition of Balance of Power at 5 p.m. on Bloomberg.